Hello, my name is Joy Ware,
And my name is Tasnia Alam.
and for our final project, we conducted research on the erasure of Black women's influence in social and political activism, specifically in the United States of America.
This is why our presentation is called Critically Undervalued. Our original research question was, why is there such a rigid culture and reinforced expectation on how young Black women participate in activism? Our final thesis statement actually deviated very far from this original research question. As you can see, the wording of the original question is not very clear. And when we were conducting research, it was difficult for us to find quantifiable examples of cultural expectations that are placed on Black women during activism situations. And we found that many of the societal and political expectations Black women are faced with in activism are not well documented. So there's a lot to unpack surrounding the issue. And we essentially just decided to change directions for the scope of our research project.
So, this is how we arrived at our final thesis that you see here, which reads Black female leadership and impact in American social political movements is critically undervalued in the United States. Their contributions to activism face continuous erasure.
I would like to specifically further emphasize the point that we are specifically focusing on the United States of America and that specific demographic.
So, in terms of our research abstract, we came up with the paragraph Black women are persistent in developing radical ideas about social transformation and have been integral in fighting for equality within many areas of U.S. society, including the criminal justice system, healthcare system, news media, popular culture, and education system as well. There is an undervaluation of Black women's toil and struggles in activism, as historical and contemporary narratives unfairly erase or discredit the monumental influences of Black women activists.
So, we need to define a few terms before we can proceed further. We need to define what activism is and what erasure is in this context. And there are many assumptions of what activism can look like, and there are different definitions of what constitutes activism, depending on where you're analyzing from. So, to define this term in this context, I found information from Simmons University, which helped me to define activism for our project, which would be activism is the practice of taking direct action to achieve political or social goals. People cannot always risk macro activist actions, such as becoming, putting yourself in dangerous situations, getting arrested, attending protests. Micro activism, or what is perceived as small acts of activism, can and does lead to macro activist situations. Um, and it's also further important to emphasize social movements take years and decades to grow, develop, and gain strength. So even small steps and small movements towards an activist action does have value.
Erasure is often considered an umbrella term for the intentional exclusion of marginalized persons or a group of marginalized people from the center of historical acknowledgement, record, and or current discussion of events. When we considered erasure as part of our thesis statement, we considered what it meant historically for these Black women, female leaders to be erased from the narrative, to be diminished. In this context, we are using the definition to be Black and female in America means that you are ignored, silenced, and sometimes erased. The very fabric of history would be quite different for all of us without the contributions, tears, blood, and love of Black women. As a result of the intersection of patriarchy and white supremacy, Black women are too often left exhausted, overworked, and then left out of the historical narrative. So, when we considered the key research that we were going to use to shape our thesis, we found incredible sources. The general idea is that Black women serve as prominent architects of American social movements, yet receive little recognition for their activism. Black female contributions to activism are constantly overshadowed or diminished, especially when you look in comparison to their white or male counterparts. Not only are Black women's contributions to activism diminished, though, they are specifically and strategically erased from historical as well as contemporary narratives. Erasure is a problem which affects them heavily because it discredits their contributions to activism, therefore narrowing the scope of their reach. As they consistently serve as tedious activists and sources of social inspiration, we consider overlooked figures such as Frances Thompson, Yvonne Carter, and Claudette Colvin later in our presentation, as they are not widely known or considered in the public eye.
Okay, so I would like to talk about an early example of erasure of Black female activism in the United States. So, if we consider 1866 in the Reconstruction era of formerly Confederate Memphis, Tennessee, the Memphis riots took place during this year. And if you look at the image to the right, we see a very chaotic scene of women running with their children, dead bodies laying on the ground, people running into the river, and guns being shot, and just a terrible chaos. So, if we consider this, racial tensions in this era, along with the social and political issues that would have existed in a 1 year post Confederate Tennessee, it is incredible to consider the fact that in this area, white men raided and pillaged Black communities while specifically targeting Black women and Black women to rape and Black houses to rob. In 1866, there was a congressional committee which took place. Five Black women, including Frances Thompson, who was actually transgender, a transgender woman, testified about being raped by male white rioters during the Memphis riots. The primary source document that I was able to obtain the transcript of the sources from is directly from the U.S. Congress of House of Representatives. So this transcript actually provided a lot of insight. And essentially, it's important to understand that with this, this is a historical event because when you Google anti-rape movement, you are bombarded with images, narratives, and information relating to the white-led female anti-rape activism in the 1960s and 70s. However, this congressional committee is actually one of the true origins of the anti-rape movement in the United States. It was very difficult for me to find significant documentation on activist Frances Thompson and the other women who testified with her. Advocacy and activism are often conflated in situations such as this, but it's important to understand that the fact that these Black women in the 1860s were testifying against white men in a congressional committee setting, testifying that they had been raped, robbed, in this era, this was a monumental advance socially. Some of these women had not been free for a year and were testifying in court that they had been raped by white men. These women campaigned against sexual violence, and more importantly, they laid groundwork for future anti-rape activists, such as the ones that America recognizes in the 1960s and 70s. And just to further hone in that point, by 1866, there was already longstanding racially abusive narratives against Black people, specifically to disenfranchise African Americans and justify racial violence. White Southerners portrayed Black men as these raping mythological incubus beasts that attacked white women as they slept. So when Frances Thompson and the four other Black women appeared before the congressional committee, they were directly contrasting the egregious social norm by saying, no, we have been raped by white men. Frances Thompson had been raped by white men. And this goes against the unsubstantiated charges of rape by white women that Black men had been a part of, and had the political rhetoric that had been fueled for decades. Black female activism had limitations in this time period, and it's important to just further understand microactivism can pave the way for macroactivism and social change. Specifically for Frances Thompson as a transgender woman, to testify that her and her housemate Lucy Smith had been brutally gang raped by 7 men, and they had been threatened that pistols would be drawn against them, that their houses would be fired, and that they'd be shot if they did not allow the men to rape them, is a very significant moment for anti-rape activism in the United States. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about how Black women are undervalued.
In the United States, there's a vast history of Black women participating across most major social movements. Although countless women played important roles at various points during the Black freedom struggle, it is men who still receive more attention and credit for the successes of the movement. Not crediting Black women activists contributions erases them from historical narratives. Commemorative efforts and historical narratives honor white male and female and Black male contribution over Black female contribution, when the reality of their actions challenges these narratives. Many African American women operated as leaders at the local level, serving as the bridge between national and grassroots organizations. Black women have found ways to organize and lead monumental change for an equal society for all people, not just other Black individuals, as seen with the effects of civil rights or the anti-rape movement, which was mentioned earlier.
So, to further hone in on the point that Joy has just made, we can analyze the Black Panther Party, which was established in 1966 in Oakland, California. So, the BPP was formed essentially with the purpose of alleviating oppression of Black communities and seeking to end police brutality, if you want to kind of just get a succinct definition for it. The BPP is known for its militancy and pursuit of Black power ideology through the affirmation of specifically Black masculinity. And it's really interesting when you recognize and research the fact that at peak, women made up over 60% of the Black Panther Party. Yet their presence has remained largely understated in the public eye up until recent years. So, since the Black Panther Party's inception, women have labored and fought alongside these male Black Panther counterparts to accomplish revolutionary goals, despite continuous resistance to Black female leadership and their rampant over sexualization. Historically, the role of women Panthers is either reduced to an insignificant minority or left out entirely from historical narratives. Um, there are speculations as to why this has happened, and educational Black female Panthers were often active in educational roles, providing free food and healthcare, and are other ways that Black female membership carried out. So they carried out these life sustaining grassroots efforts that went far beyond just politics. But this is still obviously a form of social activism. And as we can see here, Yvonne Carter, who is actually the widow of Alprentice Bunchy Carter, who was one of the prominent founding members of the Black Panther Party. Yvonne is much less well known as a Black Panther member. However, here she is pictured teaching children of Black Panther Party at the Intercommunal Youth Institute, which is the first full-time Liberation Day school. And this was in 1972 that this photo was taken. So essentially, we have Black women's contributions being critically undervalued in the Black Panther Party. And furthermore, their actual revolutionary goals and their leadership is erased from historical narrative.
So, how do we still see erasure in present day was a very important aspect for us to consider in our research presentation. One of the sources that was found for for our thesis statement introduced the fact that many Black women currently in present day have had their first exposure to the sheer impact of Black women activists for the very first time once they entered college in that sort of education hierarchy. So, in one of my examples, you can see that Black women who participated in a survey said that it was the very first time that they had been exposed to such a curriculum, to Black leaders, Black female leaders, and their influence. One of the participants said, and I quote, "I think that when my identity as a Black woman stood out, it was when I came to campus in my first year as a Black woman, and I realized that a lot of times the fact that I tend to put myself as Black first, and that there's a lot of struggles and things that I go through as a Black woman that a Black man may not go through. So in this instance, she became more aware of the fact that Black-led activists, Black women, Black female activists hold a strong influence over how she perceived herself. And so there's another quote as well that I found in a sample that said that when she was first exposed to the Me Too movement, she was not made aware of the fact that the founder of the Me Too movement was a Black woman. And I think that's very interesting because the true founder of the Me Too movement, Tarana Burke, wasn't necessarily made the very face of the movement that she founded. This erasure still exists today, and we must take responsibility to account for the erasure of the past and make sure that the full spectrum of Black womanhood is well known. Examination of the contributions Black women have made to society and the way that America strips Black women of their visibility for such contributions is incredibly important. And this is also important to recognize how erasure first manifests. So, erasure manifests itself in the American education system and the provided curriculum. That is the first exposure that we really have to a structured history. And there's still current political debate about critical race theory that's being banned from secondary school curriculum under the false pretense that teaching children about America's racist history will invoke racism or that it's just something that needs to not be taught. When the truth is, African American history is absolutely integral to our full comprehension of the past and our acknowledgement of that history. So it means, so one of the things is that if we do not fully acknowledge our history, we are doomed to repeat it. And so the intersection of the patriarchy and the white supremacy has allowed for the erasure of Black women to persevere. And that's seen with the foundation of the educational system that purposely erases Black female leaders from the curriculum, as well as their impact in African American history. And as we know, this educational system is an incredibly influential channel that conveys information and has continuously failed to uphold the discussion and narrative of overshadowed Black female activists in history. There is a quote I found here that speaks about Claudette Colvin and how she has been acknowledged as the first to keep her seat upon a Google search. Claudette Colvin, who was arrested in March 1955 for refusing to give up her seat on the bus to a white person in Montgomery, Alabama, she quotes that.
She quotes that, "My mother told me to be quiet about what I did. She told me to let Rosa be the one. White people aren't going to bother Rosa. They like her." The NAACP actually strategically did not publish Claudette and her bus segregation protest due to her feisty character and perhaps a dark complexion, as she did not fit the typical narrative that you would usually see for an activist at the time. It's important to note that when you compare her to Rosa Parks, who was a seasoned, prepped civil rights activist, already in her early 40s by 1955. Claudette was 15. And it's not to say Rosa or Claudette are better or worse activists than one another. It's just important to make the distinction that Claudette's activism was relegated to the margins of influence and social recognition due to her particular intersectionality. Overall, the history of Black liberation, especially in the case of Black women who are part of them, is othered and often relegated and treated as less important aspect of American history, especially if those women and their actions do not fit contemporary narratives of what activism and Black activism should be.
Moreover, the erasure and lack of acknowledgement has also led many Black female activists today and in history to activism burnout, and it even discourages young Black women from wanting to participate in activism if they are never to receive proper acknowledgement for their contributions. The erasure of Dr. Pauli Murray is also incredibly important when you consider she was another woman who refused to give up her seat 15 years before Rosa Parks and yet is not even properly credited for that circumstance and for that resistance against segregation. She is a feminist icon ahead of her time, and she challenged race and gender discrimination in legal, societal, academic, and religious circles. And yet today, not many would recognize the name of Dr. Pauli Murray or her indelible impact on American law, women's rights, and civil rights as we know it today. As a Black queer feminist woman, Polly Murray has almost been completely erased from the narrative. She should be more widely recognized for her contribution to multiple communities of her identity.
And just to further emphasize on that point, while historians and more academic communities and circles, or people that are versed in the subject matter, may know her, most Americans may not know this figure due to that erasure and undervaluement that we see present. So, a couple conclusion statements and resolutions that we have proposed for our presentation. Black women have been integral to the social and political developments of the United States for centuries. Black female activists sacrificed personal safety, mental well being, in order to help radicalize social transformations and help them come to fruition. However, historical and contemporary narratives undervalue the significance of Black female activist contributions, especially when compared to male and white counterparts. So when we see these contributions being erased and relegated to the margins, the role of Black women can be reduced to an insignificant minority or left out entirely. The research that we conducted is important as it negates this erasure. By even just simply speaking of these figures, we are helping them become less erased. And it helps end the erasure narrative that plagues American history and the analysis of American history.
We need to continue to uphold a history that gives proper credit, especially to Black women, where credit is due. I believe a resolution is to build a safe space that affirms Black women and is free from sexism, misogyny, and environments in which men are centered. It is vital that my daughter, this is a quote as well, it is vital that my daughter and other Black girls who can see themselves in their work and that they are included when we shout, all Black lives matter. This is a very important quote that we want to end our presentation on, which is that Black women's existence is an act of resistance, a form of embodied activism that develops across the lifespan. Audre Lorde, 1978.
And this is our APA bibliography. And we would also like to include in our recording our final annotated bibliography, which we'll be turning in separately.